Man returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. It happened in an instant. One moment, John Miller was balancing on the scaffold, securing a steel beam, and the next, he was free-falling through the air. His hands grasped at nothing, his breath caught in his throat, and time seemed to slow. His co-workers shouted, but their voices were distant, muffled by the sheer terror of the fall. Then, impact. The world went black. John had been working construction for nearly 20 years. He'd seen accidents before, but none like this. The scaffold had been stable all morning, yet somehow something had failed. Maybe a loose bolt, maybe a snapped cable. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the sudden, sickening realization that this was it. Paramedics rushed to the site within minutes. His co-workers, some frozen in shock, others frantically calling for help, stood helplessly around his body. No pulse, no breath. His chest lay still beneath the thick layer of dust that had settled over him like a shroud. The lead paramedic checked his watch. The call had come in 10 minutes ago. Too long. Even if they revived him, chances were he wouldn't wake up the same. Brain damage, organ failure, something catastrophic. That's how these things usually went. But John wasn't there anymore. He felt warmth first. A strange, almost electric sensation flooded his body, as if he was floating in some unseen current. His pain was gone, his fears dissolved. The weight of his body, his responsibilities, his worries, all of it lifted. Then he realized he wasn't alone. A figure stood before him, bathed in an indescribable light. It was not blinding, but it was immense, all-encompassing. The presence exuded peace, but there was also power, an undeniable, unfathomable authority that sent a tremor through his very soul. John tried to speak, but no words came. He felt small, insignificant, and yet he knew, without a doubt, who stood before him. Jesus. The name wasn't spoken, but it filled him. A deep understanding, like a forgotten truth returning to his mind, settled over him. He fell to his knees, unable to stand under the weight of the divine presence. The warmth intensified. He was not afraid, though he knew he should be. The figure radiated both love and judgment, and John could feel every part of himself laid bare. His thoughts, his deeds, his past failures and regrets, they were all exposed in an instant. Then, the voice came. It wasn't a voice like any on earth. It didn't vibrate through the air, nor did it enter his ears. It was within him, around him, a voice that carried weight beyond words. You must see. John's surroundings shifted. The warmth faded, replaced by something colder. He was no longer standing in the presence of divine light. Instead, he found himself in a darkened room, watching a man hunched over a desk, exhausted, his face buried in his hands. Zelensky. John didn't need to be told. He knew instantly who he was looking at. The Ukrainian president sat alone, the weight of his nation's suffering evident in his every movement. The war had taken its toll, not just on the country, but on him. His eyes were hollow, his face lined with stress. Papers littered the desk, maps, documents, letters from world leaders. Then, another figure entered the room, tall, confident, unapologetic. Trump. The contrast was stark. Where Zelensky looked beaten, exhausted, Trump looked resolute. A deal was being made. John could feel it, even before words were spoken. But something was wrong. The energy in the room was heavy, tense. Trump was not offering aid or alliance. He was offering an ultimatum. Zelensky's lips pressed into a thin line. His hands clenched the edge of the desk. He was out of options, and they both knew it. The war would end, but not in his favor. John felt himself being pulled away, the scene dissolving before his eyes. He wanted to scream, to ask what was happening, but the divine presence returned. You must remember. The warmth surrounded him once more, but this time there was an urgency to it. He felt as though he was being propelled backward, faster and faster, through light and darkness alike. And then, a gasp. Air filled his lungs. The paramedics jerked back, stunned. His chest rose, his eyes fluttered open. One of them dropped a clipboard. John Miller had come back from the dead, and he had a message the world needed to hear. Zelensky sat at the long oak table, a deep furrow in his brow, his fingers tapping restlessly against the surface. The room was dimly lit, casting heavy shadows against the wall, mirroring the weight in his chest. He had spent years rallying his people, refusing to surrender, rejecting any notion of defeat. Ukraine had fought against impossible odds, endured relentless bombings, the destruction of entire cities, and yet they had held strong. But now, he was staring at something even more dangerous than war: political abandonment. Across from him sat a team of advisors, their faces just as grim. They were waiting for something none of them wanted to hear. Then, the door opened. Every head turned as the figure walked in with an air of unmistakable authority. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Some of the advisors sat up straighter, others stiffened in quiet defiance. There was no need for introductions. Donald Trump strode forward, his presence undeniable. Unlike the usual political meetings Zelensky was used to, there was no small talk, no polite exchanges. This wasn't diplomacy. This was something else. "I'm here to end this war," Trump said finally, his voice carrying through the room like a final verdict. Zelensky's jaw tightened. The words should have been comforting, but they weren't. "I have no interest in seeing this drag on," Trump continued. "The American people have had enough. The world has had enough. And frankly, so have I." Zelensky inhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had seen the reports. He had read the messages trickling in from US intelligence. Things were shifting. The tides were changing. "You need to understand something, Mr. President," Trump said, leaning forward. "Your fight is admirable. No one questions your courage, your resolve. But war isn't just fought on the battlefield. It's fought in rooms like these. And I'm telling you, it's over." Zelensky's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "Are you saying we should surrender?" Trump exhaled, shaking his head. "I'm saying it's time to negotiate, and you're not in a position to make demands." A heavy silence fell over the room. Zelensky's eyes darted toward his advisors. Some of them avoided his gaze. Others looked at him with silent urging, pleading even. They knew what he knew. They didn't have the resources to hold out much longer. The promised aid had been slow to arrive, and some had been cut entirely. Troops were exhausted, their reserves thinning. And now, Trump was here. Not as an ally, but as a deal-maker. Zelensky swallowed. "What are the terms?" Trump leaned back in his chair, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "Ukraine will keep its sovereignty," he said. "But you will cede territory. The war ends with a peace deal. No NATO membership. No further American intervention. No more weapons. Putin gets a piece of what he wants, and in return, he agrees to stop." The room erupted in quiet murmurs, a ripple of unease washing over the advisors. Zelensky's blood ran cold. He knew what this meant. Russia wouldn't just be handed land. It would be a message to the world. That force worked. That destruction led to victory. That the world, no matter how much it claimed to stand for justice, would always negotiate with the aggressor. He shook his head. "That's unacceptable." Trump sighed. "It's not about what's acceptable, Volodymyr. It's about reality." Zelensky's mind flashed to the civilians, the soldiers still fighting in the trenches, the families displaced by war. Was this what they had suffered for? To be told that they had to give up? That justice was nothing more than a bargaining chip? Trump's voice cut through his thoughts. You can reject this, but I promise you, if you do, Ukraine stands alone. No more aid, no more weapons, no more protection. You need to decide what's best for your people. Zelensky felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The world had fought wars before. Some had ended in liberation, others in compromise. He had sworn never to give in, never to let his people suffer in vain. But he also knew what abandonment looked like. He knew what it meant when promises made by powerful allies were suddenly retracted. Trump was right about one thing. He wasn't in a position to make demands. The air in the room was thick with tension. Zelensky's lips parted, but for the first time in a long time, he had no words. Because deep down, a terrible truth was beginning to sink in. The war was ending, but not in Ukraine's favor. News of the deal spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, headlines across the world blasted the shocking revelation. Ukraine to concede land in historic peace deal brokered by Trump. The world stood still in disbelief. Social media erupted in chaos, some hailing Trump as a peacemaker, others accusing him of betraying Ukraine and handing Putin a victory on a silver platter. Protests broke out in Kyiv almost immediately. Thousands flooded the streets, waving Ukrainian flags, chanting in defiance. No surrender! No surrender! Their voices echoed through the city, a city that had withstood the worst of war and refused to kneel. Mothers who had lost their sons in battle wept as they held up photos of their loved ones. Soldiers, battle-worn and exhausted, clenched their fists, rage burning in their eyes. They hadn't fought, bled, and sacrificed for this. They hadn't endured years of bombings and destruction just to be told their land was no longer theirs. In Washington, reporters cornered officials in the White House hallways, demanding answers. Is the United States abandoning Ukraine? Will Congress approve the deal? What about the people of Ukraine? Do they have a say? The EU scrambled to respond. European leaders, many of whom had backed Ukraine with arms and aid, were blindsided. France and Germany called emergency meetings. Poland, which had welcomed millions of Ukrainian refugees, condemned the deal outright. This is not peace, one Polish official declared. This is capitulation. Meanwhile, in Russia, the reaction was a stark contrast. The Kremlin celebrated. Russian state TV broadcasted triumphant speeches, their anchors grinning with barely contained glee. The West has bowed to reality, one commentator declared. Zelensky is finished. And yet not everyone in Russia was cheering. Behind the scenes, whispers of unease grew among those who had quietly opposed the war. Was this truly peace? Or was it merely a pause before the next inevitable conflict? As the world's governments scrambled to react, ordinary people took to the streets, their voices ringing across continents. In New York, London, Paris, and Berlin, thousands rallied in support of Ukraine. They called it a betrayal, a stain on history, a warning that might would always make right if the world allowed it. Back in Ukraine, the weight of it all settled on Zelensky's shoulders like an unbearable stone. He stood in his office, staring at the map of his country, the country he had sworn to protect. The red lines marking the new, agreed borders felt like an open wound, a wound that might never heal. His people wouldn't accept this. He knew that. And perhaps, neither would he. And yet, what choice did he have? Then, as if answering his unspoken question, his phone buzzed. A message. A single sentence from one of his top commanders at the front lines. "Sir, what do we do now?" John Miller felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The vision had shown him so much, but this was the part that shook him to his core. He turned back toward the light, toward the presence that still stood with him. Jesus' expression was solemn, his gaze piercing through John's very soul. "You have seen the truth," the voice spoke again, resonating through every fiber of John's being. John swallowed hard. "Is there nothing that can stop it?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Jesus remained silent for a moment, then finally spoke. "The course of men is determined by the choices they make, but choices can be influenced, truth can be revealed, and action can change the tide." John's heart pounded. "What am I supposed to do?" "Tell them." The words sent a shiver through him. Tell them. Tell who? Who would believe him? "You must warn them. You must awaken them. For what comes next will be worse than war if they do not see." A flood of images rushed through John's mind. Civil unrest, political turmoil, a world divided, and beyond that, something darker, something sinister lurking beneath the surface of it all. The war ending was only the beginning. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision faded. The warmth was gone. Cold. Pain. A gasp ripped through his lungs. His body jerked, his back arching off the stretcher as the paramedics screamed in shock. He was back, alive, and he knew what he had to do. John Miller's eyes shot open, his breath ragged, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. He was alive. The paramedics hovering over him froze in shock. One of them, a woman with a trembling hand, reached for his wrist, checking his pulse again as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "He was gone," one of them muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. No pulse. No heartbeat. But John could hear his heart now, a deafening rhythm in his ears. He felt the sting of fresh oxygen burning his lungs, the sharp pain in his ribs from the fall, the cold metal of the stretcher pressing against his back. He was back in the world of the living, but everything was different. He had seen things no man was meant to see. John tried to sit up, but a paramedic gently pushed him down. "Easy, man. You need to stay still." "No," John croaked, his throat dry. "I need to speak." The paramedics exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man with a weary face, leaned in. "You were dead for almost 15 minutes, Miller. Whatever it is, it can wait." But John knew it couldn't. He turned his head, scanning the crowd of construction workers standing just beyond the ambulance, their faces a mix of fear and awe. These were men he had worked with for years. They had seen accidents before, but nothing like this, nothing that defied logic. John forced his voice to work. "I saw him." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some men stepped closer. Others took a hesitant step back, as if afraid of what he might say next. "I saw Jesus," John said, his voice stronger now, "and he gave me a message." Silence. Then one of the younger guys scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, man. You just hit your head. You're in shock." But the older paramedic, the one who had checked his pulse, the one who had seen with his own eyes that John was gone, didn't look away. He was listening. He wanted to hear more. John swallowed, his throat aching, but he pushed through. The war. The war in Ukraine. It's not going to end the way we think. Zelensky is going to be forced to accept a deal, not because he wants to, because he has no choice. More murmurs, more uncertain looks. John kept going. Trump. He's the one making it happen. But this isn't the victory people think it is. It's something else. It's a shift. A turning point. And what comes after, it's worse. He could see the doubt in their eyes. Some of them thought he had lost his mind. And maybe he had. But he had seen it. He had felt it. The world was teetering on the edge of something much bigger than just a war between two nations. One of the men spoke up hesitantly. "What are you saying?" John closed his eyes, remembering the weight of Jesus' words, the warning, the urgency. He opened them again and looked at them, one by one. "I'm saying that we're being played," he said, his voice steady. "I'm saying that the world thinks peace is coming, but it's not. This deal, this so-called peace, it's not real. It's a setup for something bigger, something darker. And when it happens, no one's going to be ready for it." The days that followed felt like a blur. John was discharged from the hospital with nothing but a mild concussion and a body sore from the fall. Medically, he shouldn't have survived, but he did, and he knew why. He had a mission now. At first, he tried telling his story to the people around him, his family, his co-workers, his pastor. Some listened, some dismissed him, some looked at him with pity, as if he had gone insane. But he didn't stop. He started recording himself, sharing his vision, warning people about what was coming. He spoke of Zelensky's forced decision, of Trump's negotiations, of the uneasy silence that would follow before something much worse took its place. And people listened. First it was just a few, then hundreds, then thousands. His story spread online, reaching audiences across the world. Some called him a prophet, others called him a liar. But then, the deal was announced. Just as he had seen, Zelensky accepted terms dictated not by Ukraine, but by outside forces. Russia got its concessions. NATO's doors to Ukraine remained closed, and the world sighed in relief, believing the war was finally over. But John knew better, because the night before the announcement, he had another vision. It came in flashes, a city in flames, a leader removed from power, a deal shattered before it even had time to settle, and the sound of marching. A different kind of war brewing, one that would not be fought on battlefields alone, but in the streets, in homes, in nations turning on themselves. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning.